Thanks. So I am really pleased to be here to present my work to fellow educators. And as JP mentioned, I study how working in our digital age has changed people, how it affects our lives. Now, my starting point is that people are by nature monochronic. And monochronic means that you prefer to finish one task through to completion before moving on to something else. That's the way I am, and that's the way most people are. However, what does it mean to live in a digital age? It means that we are surrounded by different devices. People use computers and cell phones, iPads, some people have multiple screens, and people are constantly switching their attention. And some idea pops into your head, and immediately you have the opportunity to look it up and satisfy that whim. So we are seduced by information that's available pretty much around the clock, and we have the opportunity to connect with people anywhere, anytime. And so this has become a polychronic world, which means that people are constantly shifting attention between different kinds of information. So this interest in trying to understand how digital media has affected our lives led me to ask some very basic questions that I'll cover today. So first, how fragmented is our attention when people use digital media? How much do people actually shift attention? Does digital media use affect mood, and how so? And does digital media use affect stress? And these are just examples of some of the questions that I look at. Now, usually when you think about studying technology use, you bring people into a laboratory and you set up very controlled conditions. But I think that if you really want to understand how people are using tools like digital media, you have to go to where people are, and you have to understand their use of these tools in their natural environments. And so I prefer to go where people are. And so I see the world as a living laboratory. Now, I'm also fortunate to be investigating this issue at the same time that there's been a revolution in the development of sensor technologies. And how many of you have some kind of wearable, some kind of tracking device? Okay, so there are commercial devices, there are many prototypes that are being developed. I'm involved in other research that's developing prototypes, but this enables us to understand a lot about people as they move about in their daily environments. So I study technology use in the wild. And I have two main projects that I'm going to talk about today. The first is understanding the use of digital media with information workers. So I'm guessing probably all of you here are information workers. And what is an information worker? It's someone whose primary job is dealing with information of some kind or another. Most of you are teachers. You're dealing with information. You're using devices. So you're also dealing with electronic information. I also study millennials. And in particular, I've been looking at college-age students. And college-age students are, for the most part, the future information workers of our country. So how they use digital media not only impacts their university careers, but it also has impacts down the road. So I mentioned I use a lot of different kinds of devices, and I just want to run through these with you because it's really important to understand how I collect the data. So first of all, to study stress, I have used heart rate monitors. We also use wrist devices. We measure the distance between heartbeats and the variability of that. It's called heart rate variability, and that provides a measure of stress. We look at people's mood and their ability to focus from the individual's perspective, and we use a technique that's called experience sampling, where people get a probe on their smartphones or on their computers, and the probe will ask something like, how happy, or what is your mood right now? And people will have a scale from positive to negative affect, or it might ask them, how engaged were you in the thing you were doing right now? We look at face-to-face interaction using sense cams. That's this image here, and these are devices that take continual photos as people are moving around, and then we apply software that can detect whether there's a human face in the image or not with very high accuracy. We look at people's digital activity, so we log people's computer and phone use. We look at people's activity tracking using things like Fitbits. We measure people's sleep using the same kinds of devices. And then we give people a whole lot of different kinds of demographic and personality measures so that we can correlate, we can better understand people's behavior. Now, at this point, I want to just let you know that I'm going to be showing a lot of data. And because I love data, I'm a data geek, we are collecting these measures to the second, and we're synchronizing all these measures together. So at any point in time, we can try to understand, here's the person's stress, here's what they were doing on the computer, oh, and at this point, here's what their mood was. So we put all this data together so that we can try to get a comprehensive picture of what's happening. Now, I'm also, I realize that data can be overwhelming. So at quite a lot of points, I'm just going to give you a single sentence which explains the result. Please understand that that single sentence has a whole lot of data behind it. And I'm happy to answer questions about details of the data. So let's start with the first question: how fragmented is our attention? Now, people often ask, well, hasn't attention always been fragmented? Haven't people always been switching their attention? You know, before computers, you know, think of the manager using the telephone and calling different people and meeting with different people. Well, the answer that I have is we don't know if attention has always shifted like that. The reason we don't know is that no one has done these kinds of detailed explorations into people's behavior, right? But we do have some information that can help us answer this question. So we dug back into the literature, and we found indeed that there were some studies where people would shadow people around the workplace, and they would take notes and they would write down, you know, here's the activity that people were doing, and we get a sense of how people distributed their time over the workday. So these two right columns are studies that were done after email became in widespread use in the workplace. And these other studies, these first 5 columns, are studies before email came into full use. This 1992 study did not really have email. So now I'm going to show you these 2 rows, and I want you to look at these 2 rows and see if you can see anything that changed since email came along versus from before email came along. This is the percentage of time people spent at desk work and the percentage of time people spent in formal scheduled meetings. Anyone see any differences there? And I'll give you a hint. This Horn and Lupton study of scheduled meetings is a bit of an anomaly. But what's the trend that you're seeing?
More desk work and less meetings.
More desk work and less meetings. So what changed Not just email, but also the introduction of IT. First of all, the proportion of time spent at desk work has nearly doubled. And number two, people spend less proportion of their time in face-to-face formal meetings. Now, if you put these two results together, what might you guess? That a lot of the work that was formerly conducted in face-to-face meetings is now being done at the desktop, either through email or through things like desktop conferencing. Now, we look at how much time people spend on any single computer screen before switching to something else. And looking at all that data, we find that the median length of time for all computer usage is 40 seconds. 40 seconds is really not a lot of time. So that means that the median duration of focus on any computer screen before switching, that's from beginning of day to end of day, day in, day out, is 40 seconds. That's the median. Not a lot of time. So, we asked ourselves that, maybe switching attention is not so bad if you're working on the same project, right? So I'm an academic. I'm in the business of writing papers. And if I'm writing a paper, I might use the internet to look up information. I might send someone an email. I might chat with a colleague, read a paper. And so I'm switching back and forth, but the idea is all the same. It's all about writing this paper. And so I had a student who, at tremendous labor, very, very labor intensive. He had shadowed people and wrote down what activities people did, and he clustered activities into their respective projects. So he had a good sense of how much time people spent in different projects. And here's what he found. So first of all, people worked on an average of about 12 projects. Now, we use the term working spheres because we think of a sphere of work as broader than a project. A working sphere could also be something you're doing for a personal project, planning a picnic. So people worked about 12 working spheres, which is about right. That's about what I work on. But their average time was only about 10 and a half minutes before they switched and worked in a different working sphere or project. 10 and a half minutes is not long. I mean, think about it. If you're reading a book, right, it takes you about 10 and a half minutes to just start to get involved in the book, and then all of a sudden your attention has shifted, right? And so the consequence of this is that people report high costs, high stress, redundant work. They have to reorient because they forgot what place they were at when they were interrupted. So it's not a very efficient way, and it's certainly not monochronic work. Now, we find there are individual differences in people's ability to focus when they're working on the computer. And in particular, we find that people who score high on the personality trait of neuroticism and who are high on impulsivity, and people who are prone to stress, those three things are people who score high on those tend to switch their attention much faster, more at a higher frequency than other people. And we call this a lack of control. We have named this general factor as lack of control. So let's talk about interruptions. Now, you think of an interruption as maybe a cell phone notification, or a colleague comes into your office, or a student comes into your office. But there's actually other kinds of interruptions, and if you're observing someone, you might see for no apparent reason they suddenly stop what they're typing in a Word document, they suddenly stop, and then they turn and check email. Or they suddenly stop and they pick up the phone. We call that an internal interruption. It's driven by something internal in them. maybe mind wandering. And one of the most surprising things I found in this research is that people are self-interrupted almost as often as being interrupted by some external source. So people complain about all the cell phone notifications they have, but a lot of it, almost as much, is self-generated interruptions. Interruptions beget interruptions. So what does this mean? So we took our data and we categorized it into bins of 1 hour each. And we looked at the relationship of external interruptions and internal interruptions in each of these hours. And we found something really interesting. We found that when external interruptions fall down, internal interruptions rise. The frequency of internal interruptions rise. And what does that suggest? It suggests to me that people are conditioned to be interrupted. In other words, their attention spans are such that if you're not going to be interrupted by some external source, then you interrupt yourself. Because, maybe it's just too much effort to sustain attention for a long period of time. So we see these self-interruptions kicking in. What happens when you get interrupted? How long does it take people to resume work? Well, we wanted to be fair, so we just looked at work interruption on the same day. Because it's not fair. What if someone gets interrupted and oops, time to go home? It doesn't make sense to see if they have resumed work. And of course, we didn't look at Fridays because you have this weekend in between. So just looking on the same day, there's good news and bad news. And the good news is that about 82% of interrupted work was resumed on the same day. That's pretty good. But here's the bad news. The bad news is that if you get interrupted, you don't go right back to that task that you were interrupted from. It takes an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to go back and resume that work. What happens in the meantime? People work on approximately 2 intervening working spheres. So here's what happens. You're working on something, you get interrupted, start working on something else. Then you interrupt from that and work on something else. And only then do you go back to the original interrupted task. So you think of it in terms of making cognitive shifts. You shift your attention once to something else, then you shift it again to something else. You can imagine how hard it is to reorient back to that initial task after you've been working on 2 other things. And that's why stress accumulates. So now we can talk about rhythms of attention. So what kinds of patterns of attention do we see over the day? So this is a visualization of how people distribute their attention over the course of the day. The black line represents when people are focused. And the blue line represents when people are bored. And the red line represents something called rote thinking. And I will get back to that, so just hold on to that thought. Now, what's interesting here is that you see 2 peak times. If you look at the black line, people's attention seems to peak about 11 a.m., about mid-morning. And it also seems to peak around 3 o'clock, mid-afternoon. Okay. Now, if you look into the literature, you find overwhelmingly that when people are focused, they tend to be happier. They have positive affect. And, attention focus has been called different things. It's been called cognitive absorption, cognitive engagement. Mindfulness is a term being used now. Flow. Anyone familiar with the term flow? Heard of it? It's when you're so immersed in doing something that you're just not aware of the passage of time. Okay. So we also know that consistently studies show that when people are bored, then people have negative affect. And you know this from your students, right? When students are bored, they're not happy campers. Now, we decided to unpack this a little bit. We thought, there's different kinds of attention. There's attention when you can be really challenged by something. There's also attention where you're just not challenged at all. And an example of that would be playing solitaire. You're engaged in playing solitaire, but it's easy, right? And it's a little bit like mindless work. And so we call that rote, a state of rote attention, or gaming, right? Gaming apps. You're just kind of doing the same thing over again, but you're engaged in it. But it's not really a challenge. So contrary to these other studies that I talked about, we find that people are happiest when they're using rote attention, this kind of mindless, doing these kinds of mindless tasks. People are happiest. Then they're next happiest when they're focused, where they're challenged in what they're doing. And then, of course, consistent with the literature, they are least happy by a long shot when they're bored. So, when people go on the computer and you go onto something like Facebook or, do some game, that's not challenging, right? That's more rote kinds of attention. Now I want to go back to this, and I want to point out something else. So if you look at that black line, the focused attention, you see that people don't come to work ramped up and ready to go. It takes them a while to ease into work. It takes them a while to ease their focus to a higher level, right? And you see at the end of the day, of course, focus drops pretty rapidly. People know they're going home. And so we thought, can there be a way that we might be able to get people to ramp up their engagement with their work a little bit faster? At the same time, there's a lot of research that shows that when people don't detach properly from work, it can have carryover effects. And you know this. You bring your work home. You haven't really left it, right? And you're thinking of all these things over and over again. So just when you thought chatbots were totally useless, we decided to experiment with a chatbot. And this is working with a student, Alex Williams, who developed SwitchPod. SwitchPod is a chatbot, which is a software agent. And basically, people were asked 2 questions, one in the morning and one in the evening. And the question in the morning was one of 2 types. It was either task-focused, what do you want to work on today? Or it was more tapping into people's feelings. How do you want to feel today? And this was a very simple text-based app, and people typed their answers in. In the evening, they were asked similar questions. Either task-based, what did you work on today? Or emotion-based, how do you feel about work today? And we found some results. We found that when people, it was the emotion-based question that really had an effect. And people tended to use more productivity apps in the morning. By productivity apps, we refer to things like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Visual Studio, things like that. And people used them at a much higher frequency in the first hour of work. So we were able to get people to ramp up their engagement with their work faster. And at the end of the day, we found that, again, it was the emotion question, how do you feel about work, that led people to send fewer work-related emails at the end of the day, which suggests that people were able to detach from work better. All right, let's talk about mood. Okay. So there's different kinds of interactions that people can have in the workplace. And we thought about how interactions make people happy. I mean, social interactions are really important. I mean, not just in the workplace, but also in school. And is there a difference in the kinds of emotions that are elicited by different kinds of interactions? And so we asked a very simple question. How do offline and online interactions affect people's mood? By offline interactions, we refer to face-to-face interactions, good old-fashioned face-to-face interactions. By online interactions, we decided to focus on the most commonly used social interaction site at this particular workplace, which happened to be Facebook. Now, I want to pose a question to you. So at the time that these social interactions occur, what do you think makes people happier? I'm going to ask either face-to-face interactions or Facebook interactions. How many of you think at the time they occur, having face-to-face interactions make people happier? Raise your hand.
Based on this picture.
Not based on this picture. Not based on this picture.
Is that
Okay, no, you wouldn't know these people, and you wouldn't know them. They're at Microsoft Research, and I'm not supposed to tell you that. Raise your hands if you think people are happier right after a Facebook interaction. How many of you think there's no difference? Couple. Okay, the answer is face-to-face. So people are happier right after they have a face-to-face interaction. Now, what about at the end of the day? So you look at the cumulative total of time that people spend in face-to-face interactions versus cumulative amount of time spent in Facebook interactions. How many of you think people are happier spending more time that day, at the end of the day, when they've had more face-to-face interaction? How many of you think the more time on Facebook is associated with being happier at the end of the day? Okay. The answer is Facebook. We were surprised. But we dug around in the data and we figured out why. And the reason is that when people are really engaged in their work, then they tend to be happier. They tend to be happier if you're really engaged in doing your work, whether it's rote or focused work. And also being engaged in your work is also associated with using Facebook. And here's how I interpret it. That if you're really engaged in your work, the last thing you want to have is a face-to-face interaction. Why? Because if you're in a face-to-face interaction, you're a prisoner of that interaction, right? You've got a greeting ritual and the interaction and a parting ritual. You can't, right? It's not socially appropriate to pull away very quickly or ignore it. But if you're really engaged in your work, Facebook affords the opportunity for a quick in and out of interaction. And we call this grazing behavior, right? It's like cows graze. People graze on Facebook. And people are in control of when they take their breaks. They can take their breaks when they want to, as long as they want to. And so that's why we think people are happier and with more Facebook use throughout the day because of being engaged in work. That's the underlying explanation. Let's talk about email and stress. So one of the most robust findings that we've found is that the more time that people spend on email during the day, the more stressed they are and also the worse mood they're in. And they also assess their productivity at the end of the day as being lower. And we control for everything we can possibly think of. You know, we control for work role and gender and baseline chronic stress. And you look at the data, right? Because we have this, we're looking at heart rate variability and we're syncing it up with what people do on the computer. And you see they go on email, the stress goes up. They go off email, the stress goes down. So it's a pretty robust finding. Now, several years ago, I really wanted to examine the role of email on stress. And it took me a long time. In fact, it took 6 years to find an organization that was willing to let its employees cut off email for a work week. And we did. And the employees wore these heart rate monitors. And here's what we found. We found that stress was significantly lower without email. Now these numbers look a little weird. You're saying, wait a minute, stress looks higher. That's because heart rate variability is actually, it's the inverse. The larger the variability, the more relaxed people are. And that's because if you're really, really relaxed, the least little stimulus will cause you to jump, and it creates high variability. But if you're really stressed, you're in a fight or flight kind of state, and so your variability is more even. We found that people focused significantly longer on any computer screen. And the flip side of that, the other way of looking at the data, is the number of switches per hour. And of course, people switched at about half the rate, right, when they were cut off from email. And it doesn't have to be that case. You know, just removing email from all the myriad of other kinds of applications people are using doesn't have to do that. Doesn't have to have this effect, but it did. Gender. Now, how many of you think that women are more capable of working with digital media based on the following criteria: fewer self-interruptions, and when a task is interrupted, resuming it at a higher rate? So how many of you think women are more capable of working with digital media compared to men? Okay. Using the same criteria, fewer self-interruptions, and resuming a task at a higher rate, how many think men are more capable? How many of you don't know? Okay. The answer is women. So women indeed were significantly less likely to self-interrupt. They were more likely to resume interrupted work than their male counterparts. They were also reported being happier in the workplace. They were more engaged in their work, and they worked in significantly more working spheres or projects than their male counterparts. I have a theory why this is the case. If we have time at the end, I'm happy to explain my theory. I'm also very interested to hear your theories. Okay, so now let's move on and talk about the Millennial Generation, which is closer to the age of the students who you work with. So the Millennial Generation is really interesting. These are not digital immigrants like me. I'm a digital immigrant because my generation straddles, living in a time before the internet and living in a time with the internet, before social media, after. And these are young people who only know the internet. So they are natives, not immigrants. And this is also the largest generation in history. So we know a few things about millennials, and there's been a lot of discussion that maybe millennials have a greater competency to multitask compared with people of an older generation. So there are studies that show millennials indeed tend to use more media at the same time, more different media compared to older generations. And a study found that 93% of millennials used instant messaging during schoolwork. This study is a few years old, and you can imagine that the technology of choice probably has changed by now. Let's get an overview of how millennials spend their time with social media. So first of all, they spend on average about an hour and 41 minutes each day. These are college students. These are 124 students who we tracked multiple days. And, it's 1 hour, 41 minutes a day. They average about 118 visits to social media per day. That means you're doing something else, and then you go to social media, and then you come back to what you were doing. But the duration of the visit is characterized as being very short. It's about a minute. So, and we find, if we break it down, we look at Facebook. Facebook averages about 49 minutes a day. 52 visits a day, again, short duration, about a minute. And all other social media, it's about similar to Facebook. Now, we find that there's not just one single profile that can characterize millennials and their use of social media. People fall into different groups. And so we used an analysis technique that enables us to cluster people into different groups. And we find the following different kinds of groups. These are preferences that these different groups have for using different kinds of social media. The first are people who tend to use these sites: Tumblr, Instagram, Twitter, LiveJournal. Facebook is in parentheses for these first three groups because everybody uses Facebook. That Facebook is not a distinguishing factor. We call this is just our label, we call it people who prefer to do social sharing with content, okay? Then we have another group, that we call that the social networking group. Now, at the time, Google Plus was very popular, so these are people who tended to use Google Plus and Facebook. Third group, their preference was for video streaming, and yes, their preference was for using YouTube and of course Facebook. And then the last one, we just for purposes of labeling, we call this text and image-based entertainment and discussion, sites like Reddit and Imgur. And Reddit is, if you know Reddit, it's a community discussion site where people discuss different topics and vote them up and down.
When is this based on? What time?
This study was done around 2014-15. So technology changes at lightning speed. And so if we were to do this study again, we probably, I would guess two things. I would guess that we would see different technology, but I would also guess that people would cluster into distinct groups as well. But, and they might be very different kinds of labels. Now, we looked at the data, and we discovered that some people, they check social media really often. Like really, really often. So we call them continual checkers. And there's other people that don't check that often. We call them infrequent checkers. So we took the top quarter of our distribution of checking and the bottom quarter, and we compared these two groups on different characteristics to see what is different about these two groups. You know, people that are constantly checking and people that just don't check a lot. First of all, we find that continual checkers tend to be younger. They tended to be freshmen and some sophomores, and infrequent checkers tended to be people who were older, tended to be seniors with some juniors. The continual checkers tended to focus more on Facebook use. The infrequent checkers tended to use more content-focused sites. Continual checkers had a much higher course load, and then they reported feeling significantly more distracted, reported feeling behind in their schoolwork. They wanted to use social media less, and they believed they were addicted to the internet. So we found those differences.
Are those numbers humans or percentages?
This is, we did a statistical test, and this is the number from the statistical test. And then you determine based on the variability, these are means, these are means, and then based on that statistical test, is there a significant difference? Sorry for not explaining that. We also, and these are means also, we also looked at the data in terms of usage. So we looked at heavy users of the computer and light users, and we used this based on just simply the amount of time that people were on the computer and phone. And so we took, again, the top quarter of the distribution and compared it to the bottom quarter so that we could see if there's characteristics between these two groups. We also looked at people who were heavy multitaskers and light multitaskers. And we determined multitasking by the frequency of switching screens, right? People who switch screens very rapidly, or the other way of looking at it is very short durations of attention focus on any screen. And we compared it to people that were light multitaskers, so people who had longer attention focus and switched less rapidly. And again, the top quarter and the bottom quarter of the distribution. Look at these differences. So people who are heavy users of the computer, they averaged using Facebook an hour and about 19 minutes a day. People who were light users of the computer, they averaged using Facebook only 12 minutes a day. And then other social media shows similar results. And then of course, if you compare heavy multitaskers, if you compare heavy multitaskers and light multitaskers, you see this large difference as well, that people who are switching very frequently spend about 55 minutes a day on Facebook, and people who don't switch that often spend about 18 and a half minutes a day. And we find a very similar pattern with the use of all other social media as well. We pulled out Facebook because it was by far, for this particular sample, it was by far the most used social media. We find something else that's really interesting. We measured people's affect, how happy they were, and we find that light users of the computer here and light multitaskers are significantly more happy than people who are heavy users of the computer and people who are heavy multitaskers. And then we looked at GPA. Now in GPA, there's no difference between heavy and light computer users. One possibility is maybe they're doing a lot of their schoolwork offline. But we do see a difference in that, this is what's surprising, that heavy multitaskers have significantly higher GPAs than people who are light multitaskers. Sleep. So, you know, college students are notorious for having poor sleeping habits. And this has negative impacts on physical and mental health. And some people argue it's due to the constant availability of mobile phones. And we know that people are very often online until late hours or wee hours of the morning. So we looked at sleep. And we calculated something called sleep debt. So what is sleep debt? So if a person needs 8 hours of sleep a night, and you only get 7 hours of sleep, then you're in debt for 1 hour. Let's say that's Sunday night. Well, then Monday night, right? Instead of catching up, you know, repaying that debt by having more sleep, you sleep again 7 hours. So now you've got even more accumulation of sleep debt. And then Tuesday night, you sleep only 6 hours. And so your sleep debt is mounting. And that's generally the pattern we see with college students over the course of the week. And usually they catch up on sleep on the weekends. But we see sleep debt accumulating over the course of the week. And here's what we found, 2 things. And the first thing should not be surprising, that the more sleep debt that one accumulates, the shorter is their focus duration on any computer screen, right? So they're switching their attention between different computer screens at a much faster rate, right? Because you don't have the cognitive resources to be able to focus. But the consequence of doing that is really interesting. The consequence is that the more sleep debt these students have, the more time they spend on Facebook. Why? Because Facebook is lightweight, doesn't involve, you know, a lot of cognitive resources to understand what's going on. It's easy, right? And so we see more Facebook use. So we always do interviews with our participants to try to get an understanding of their perspectives for what they're experiencing. And these are some representative types of comments that represent a range of different views. So one person says about switching, well, it's just encoded or something, which means that, you know, I can't control it, right? It's genetic. I have no control over it. Another person says, well, I do it to make myself feel like I'm not wasting time. So if you're switching and looking at different sites, they feel like they're actually doing something. They're accomplishing something. But another point of view expresses, well, all of a sudden stuff happens, and the next thing you know, an hour has passed and you've been on YouTube. And another point of view is that, well, it's not usually something that, it's not something that one intends to do, but something that one finds themselves doing. In other words, it's not planned, right? It's something that happens. Notice that the blame is not on themselves, it's something else. Now, so social media is viewed as both a benefit and a distraction. And there's lots of work that talks about the benefits of social media. It helps young people transition through different life phases, right? It can have a very, very important role, but it can also have a negative effect of being a distraction from other kinds of things like schoolwork. So here are 2 different representative views. The first person said, well, I got a little bit of work done and I should reward myself, and there's this constant switching between my reward and my study. So social media is a reward. You do some studying, go to social media to reward yourself. This other person says, because I spend so much time on social network sites every day and play games on it, I'll have to work at night, and that increases my stress. So stress goes up because you're delaying your work. So what we're seeing here is that computer usage may not be a driver of stress, but it may actually be a reflection of stress. For example, if someone feels very stressed, you might go to social media to seek solutions, right? Or to share these experiences in the hopes that you might be able to find a way to reduce your stress. And the result we found with lower positive affect and heavy multitaskers, well, maybe people are not getting what they think they're getting. So maybe heavy multitaskers, they're not getting the gratification that they thought they would get by going on social media, and that's reflected in finding lower positive affect. So this work could not have been done without the collaboration of a number of really great people whose names I have here. These are students and colleagues, and I would like to thank the National Science Foundation for funding, also field site companies, and very importantly, I would like to thank our participants. Thank you.